The year was 2347, and humanity had been sailing between the stars for almost 200 years. They had not rushed into the darkness the way some civilizations did, hungry and loud and eager to claim everything they could touch. Instead, they had moved slowly and carefully, building colonies on 14 star systems and connecting them through a government they called the Terran Accord. They were farmers and builders and scientists and dreamers, and they believed with all their hearts that the universe would reward those who entered it with open hands. They were wrong. First contact came not with a bang, but with a message, a signal that arrived at the edges of human space and translated itself into every human language simultaneously. It was an invitation, or rather, it was a summons. The signal came from the Galactic Conclave, an ancient coalition of more than 600 species that had governed this part of the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. The Conclave operated on a single brutal principle. You were ranked by how many wars you had won and how many worlds you had conquered. They called it the Dominion Index. A species with a high index commanded respect and trade rights and votes in the Great Chamber. A species with no index at all was nothing. Humanity had never conquered anyone. When the Terran delegation arrived at the Conclave station, a structure so vast it made Earth's moon look small, they were greeted not with curiosity, but with mild amusement. The delegation was led by Secretary General Adaze Okonkwo, a tall woman from West Africa, with silver hair and steady hands, and a voice that had talked down 3 civil conflicts back on Earth. She walked into the great chamber, with her shoulders straight and her eyes calm, and she looked out at the hundreds of alien species watching her from their tiered seats, and she did not flinch. Assigned humanity to the lowest rank, tributary class. It meant they had no vote, no official trade rights, no legal protections, and no voice in galactic affairs. They were expected to pay protection tithes to 3 patron species who would oversee them like landlords watching tenants. The first patron was the Vreth hegemony, a race of insectoid predators with black exoskeletons and razor-sharp mandibles who had built their empire on the bones of 12 conquered species. The second was the Shalkora Dominion, beings of living crystal who moved slowly but thought in centuries and had crushed rebellions with the patience of glaciers. The third was the Drelkathi Pact, amphibious creatures from a water world who smiled with too many teeth and had a reputation for cruelty that made even the Vreth uncomfortable. Secretary General Okonkwo listened to all of this. She listened to the terms, the tithes, the expectations. She listened to the Vreth. Ambassador click his mandibles in what the translator rendered as laughter when he called humanity a prey species. And then she did something that no species in the history of the Conclave had ever done upon first contact. She proposed peace, not submission, peace. She stood before 600 species and she laid out what she called the peace doctrine. Humanity would not wage war to climb the ranks. Humanity would not conquer or enslave or subjugate. Instead, humanity would earn its place through diplomacy and trade and science and art, and the simple stubborn belief that there had to be a better way to build a galaxy than soaking it in blood. The chamber went silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then it erupted in noise. Some species laughed, deep rumbling sounds and high chittering sounds and wet gurgling sounds that all meant the same thing. This was the funniest thing they had heard in decades. A few species, the smaller ones, the ones who sat in the lower tiers, with their own bruises and their own memories of being conquered, those ones did not laugh. Those ones watched Adaeze Okonkwo with something that looked almost like hope. But hope was a dangerous thing in the Conclave. The Vreth ambassador leaned forward in his seat, and his black eyes reflected the chamber lights like polished stones. "How delightful," he said through the translator. "The prey species wishes to talk. Okonkwo met his gaze and did not blink. "We do," she said, "and we will keep talking for as long as it takes." The conclave registered the peace doctrine as an official diplomatic position, mostly because they found it entertaining. Humanity was given its tributary classification and sent on its way with a pat on the head and a list of tithe payments that would have bankrupted a lesser civilization. For 2 years, things were almost normal. Humanity paid its tithes and built its trade routes and sent ambassadors to every species that would receive them. They shared their music and their food and their stories. They asked questions about alien cultures with genuine fascination. They offered help freely and asked for little in return. And then the Vreth tested them. A minor border lord named Kretvan, a Vreth commander with 400 ships and an appetite for violence, dropped out of faster-than-light travel above a small human farming colony called Harvest 7. Harvest 7 was home to 40,000 people. They grew grain that fed 3 other colony worlds. They had no military ships, no orbital weapons, no defenses of any kind. Kretvan's fleet opened fire and did not stop for 6 hours. When it was over, Harvest 7 was ash. 40,000 men and women and children, gone. The news reached Earth in a wave of grief and fury that shook the Terran Accord to its foundations. People screamed for blood. Admirals demanded retaliation. Politicians called for war. Secretary General Okonkwo sat alone in her office for a very long time. Then she stood up, and she traveled to the conclave, and she walked into the great chamber, and she filed a formal grievance against the Vreth hegemony for the unprovoked destruction of a civilian world. She presented evidence and testimony, and the names of every single person who had died on Harvest 7, all 40,000 of them, read into the official record. It took 9 hours. The gallery watched at first with boredom, then with confusion, then with something that might have been discomfort. When she finished, the conclave deliberated for 11 minutes, and ruled that the destruction of Harvest 7 was a minor territorial correction consistent with Vreth patron rights. The Vreth ambassador clicked his mandibles again. The gallery laughed again. Adieze Okonkwo stood alone on that chamber floor, with the names of 40,000 dead still echoing in the air, and the galaxy laughed at her. She returned to Earth. She did not cry where anyone could see. But that night, alone in her office, she opened her personal terminal, and she created a classified file with the highest possible security clearance. She named it Project Prometheus, and she began to plan for the day when peace would no longer be enough. 42 years is a long time to swallow your pride. But humanity had practice. In the decades that followed the destruction of Harvest 7, the Terran Accord did something that confused and frustrated and ultimately terrified the galaxy. They got to work. Not on weapons, not on warships, not on revenge. They got to work on everything else. Human engineers cracked a problem that had stumped galactic scientists for 3 centuries. The efficiency decay in slipgate technology, the faster-than-light corridors that connected star systems. Every species used them, but no one truly understood why they lost nearly half their energy in transit. A team from the University of Mars figured it out in 11 years and published the solution freely. Overnight, travel between the stars became 40% faster and 60% cheaper. The galaxy used the technology immediately, and thanked humanity never. Human doctors were next. Plague, called the Grey Wither, had been slowly killing 7 species across the outer rim, turning their tissues to powder over months of agony. No one had found a cure, because no one had bothered. The affected species were all low-ranked, all tributary class, all expendable in the eyes of the powerful. A human medical frigate called the Mercy spent 3 years in quarantine zones, and its crew of 200 doctors and researchers found a treatment that saved millions of lives. The rescued species never forgot. Human diplomats mediated a trade war between two mid-tier empires that had been building toward actual war for decades. They sat in a room for 4 months and talked and listened and talked some more, until both sides agreed to terms that neither side loved, but both sides could live with. It was boring and exhausting, and it prevented the deaths of billions, and the galaxy barely noticed. But the smaller species noticed. Civilizations, the ones who lived in the lower tiers of the conclave and knew what it felt like to be stepped on, they began reaching out to the Terran Accord in quiet ways. Secret trade deals, cultural exchanges, shared research projects. An entire generation of young aliens in the border systems grew up listening to human music and reading human books and wearing human fashion. They learned human languages for fun. They decorated their rooms with posters of Earth's cities. A Vreth teenager was caught by her parents with a human guitar, and the family scandal lasted for months. Humanity was becoming something the Conclave had never seen before. A species that was powerful not because of its military, but because everyone liked them. And that was when the powerful species decided it had gone far enough. The Vreth hegemony struck first, as they always did. They began raiding human merchant convoys along the border lanes, seizing cargo, and destroying ships, and leaving the wreckage drifting as a warning. When humanity protested to the Conclave, the Vreth claimed the convoys were in restricted space. They were not, and everyone knew it, and no one cared. Then the Vreth started taking prisoners. Human diplomats were kidnapped from neutral stations and brought to Vreth entertainment worlds, where they were interrogated on live broadcasts. The Vreth audience found it hilarious to watch the soft pink creatures try to maintain their dignity, while Vreth interrogators loomed over them with bladed arms. The broadcasts were the most watched programs in Vreth space for 2 seasons. Humanity filed grievances, and the Conclave dismissed them. The Shalkora Dominion took a different approach. They were patient beings who thought in long arcs, and they had been watching humanity's technological contributions with growing unease. A species that could solve the slipgate problem was a species that might solve other problems too. Problems that could shift the balance of power in ways the Shalkora did not want. So they passed a conclave resolution declaring all human slipgate patents to be shared galactic heritage. A legal theft of decades of research and development that stripped humanity of its most valuable intellectual property and gave the Shalkora control of the distribution rights. The vote was not even close. Humanity protested, and the Conclave shrugged. But it was the Drelkathi who went the furthest. They found an obscure law buried deep in the Conclave's tributary codes, a law that allowed patron species to claim the labor of tributary populations in underdeveloped colony worlds. They declared the human colony of New Carthage to be underdeveloped. New Carthage was home to 200,000 people, families, children, elderly, communities that had existed for 3 generations. The Drelkathi arrived, troop transports, and they rounded up every single human on the planet, and they put them in labor camps. Men and women were forced to work in mineral extraction under conditions that killed dozens every week. Children were separated from their parents and put in holding facilities, where Drelkathi guards entertained themselves by making the children fight each other for food. The Drelkathi filmed all of it. They were proud of their efficiency. Humanity screamed. They screamed at the Conclave, and they screamed at the Galactic Press, and they screamed at every species that would listen. Secretary General Okonkwo, now old and gray, and bent by decades of carrying a burden that would have broken a lesser leader, stood before the Conclave one more time. Her voice shook, not with weakness, but with something that the translator could not fully capture. Something between grief and fury that made even the senior delegates uncomfortable. Release of the New Carthage colonists. She was denied. She asked for an independent investigation into the conditions of the camps. She was denied. She asked for basic humanitarian oversight. She was denied. The Vreth ambassador told her to sit down. She returned to Earth for the last time. Admiral Ren Vasquez, the commander of the Terran Defense Fleet, met her at the shuttleport. He was a stocky man with dark eyes and scars on his hands from a life spent working on ships. He had been patient for 40 years, and he had watched his species be humiliated and robbed and enslaved, and his patience had a quality to it now that frightened the people who knew him best. "Ma'am," he said quietly as they walked together through the corridors of the Terran government complex, "we are not teaching them that we are peaceful. We are teaching them that we are safe to hurt." Okonkwo said nothing for a long time. That night, a video was leaked to the Terran press. It showed human children on New Carthage, thin and bruised and hollow-eyed, being forced into a ring by laughing Drelkothi guards. The children could not have been older than 8 or 9. They fought each other with clumsy, desperate fists, while the guards placed bets. The video spread across every human world in hours. Something broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Something in the collective soul of humanity looked at that video and quietly decided that enough was enough. Secretary General Okonkwo sat in her office and watched the video 3 times. Then she opened the classified file she had created 40 years ago on the worst night of her life. Project Prometheus. It had been updated every single year since its creation, quietly and secretly, by the brightest military and strategic minds humanity had ever produced. She read through it slowly. It was thorough, was terrifying. It was ready. She placed her hand on the screen, and she whispered words that would change the galaxy forever. God forgive us. She died 4 months later. The official cause was heart failure. Those who knew her best said her heart had been failing for 42 years, one indignity at a time, one atrocity at a time, one unanswered plea at a time. She had held the line longer than anyone had a right to ask. Now, the line was moving. Chancellor Elias Kane was not like Ades Okonkwo. Where she had been warm, he was cold. Where she had believed in the goodness of others, he believed in preparation. Where she had wept for the dead, he had counted them and filed them away in a part of his mind that never forgot and never forgave. He was 46 years old when he took office, a lean man with pale eyes and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone, no matter what he was saying. The press called him the Ice Chancellor. His first act in office was to reaffirm the peace doctrine publicly. His second act, done in a room buried deep beneath the Terran capital with no windows and no recording devices, was to activate Project Prometheus in full. The plan was elegant in a way that only something built over 42 years of quiet desperation could be. It had been constructed in layers by people who understood that when the time came, humanity would get exactly one chance, and if they failed, they would not get another. The first layer was the fleet. For 4 decades, in asteroid fields and dead systems, and places so remote that no alien patrol had ever visited them, humanity had been building warships. Not the sleek, elegant cruisers that galactic powers favored, ships designed for short, decisive battles that lasted hours, and settled disputes between species who both expected to survive. Human ships were different. They were ugly and thick and overbuilt with redundant systems, stacked on top of redundant systems. They had triple-layered hulls and backup reactors and manual overrides for every automated function. They were designed by engineers who had studied every war the Conclave species had ever fought, and who had asked a simple question: what if a ship refused to die? Admiral Ren Vasquez commanded this fleet from a dreadnought he had named the Patient Hand. Under his command sat 3,200 warships crewed entirely by volunteers. men and women who had signed up knowing that when the day came, they might not come home. Many of them were from military families who had spent their entire careers pretending to be nothing more than a modest defense force. Many of them had family on New Carthage. The second layer was intelligence. Every human who had been sent to alien space in the last 20 years, every cultural exchange student, every trade representative, every aid worker, every musician on tour, every chef at a human restaurant, had been given basic intelligence training before they left. Not all of them were spies. Most were simply observers who reported what they saw through encrypted channels that looked like personal messages home. But some of them were much more than observers. Some of them had spent years mapping alien military installations and communication networks and supply routes, and they had done it so quietly and so patiently that no one had ever suspected them, because no one in the galaxy believed that humans were capable of deception on that scale. They were wrong about that too. The third layer was infrastructure. Every slipgate that human engineers had built or repaired over the last 4 decades contained a hidden military override code. Every human-designed communication relay had a secondary function. Every piece of technology that humanity had so generously shared with the galaxy had a back door that no alien engineer had ever found, because they had never thought to look. Humanity had spent 42 years making itself indispensable to galactic infrastructure, and in doing so, it had woven itself into the galaxy's nervous system like threads of steel hidden inside silk. The fourth layer was knowledge. Humanity had studied its enemies with the obsessive thoroughness of a species that knew it would be outnumbered 50-1. They knew the Vreth command structure better than most Vreth officers did. They knew the exact frequency at which Shalkora crystalline communication networks could be disrupted. They knew the chemical compound that Drelkathi used to maintain their amphibious skin in dry environments, and they knew what happened when that compound was unavailable. They knew the political fractures within the conclave, which species hated each other, which alliances were built on fear rather than loyalty, which empires would shatter at the first real pressure. They knew everything, and for 2 years, Chancellor Kane let the galaxy see nothing. He continued the peace doctrine. He smiled at conclave sessions. He filed meaningless grievances that everyone ignored. He was so perfectly calm and so perfectly cooperative that even the Vreth ambassador began to find him boring. Behind the mask, the final preparations moved with quiet precision. Positioned in dead systems along every major attack corridor, medical ships were loaded and hidden. Evacuation plans for every human civilian in alien space were finalized down to the minute. Soldiers trained in zero gravity and in alien atmospheres and in close-quarters combat against opponents 3 times their size. They trained until they could fight in their sleep. They trained until fighting was as natural as breathing. And then the day came. Chancellor Kane traveled to the conclave for what he announced would be a major diplomatic address. The gallery was full because the humans always provided entertainment, even if it was just the sad kind. He stood on the chamber floor in a simple dark suit, with no medals and no symbols of rank, and he looked up at 600 species, and he spoke. His voice was calm. It was always calm. He presented a list of demands that were so reasonable they bordered on modest. Release the enslaved population of New Carthage immediately. Return the stolen slipgate patents to the Terran Accord. Deliver the Vreth commander Krethvon to stand trial for the destruction of Harvest 7. And grant humanity the basic membership rights that the Conclave's own charter guaranteed to any civilization that had contributed to galactic welfare. He laid out the legal basis for each demand. He cited Conclave law. He was thorough and precise, and completely correct on every single point. The Vreth ambassador did not let him finish. "Know your place, tributary," he said, and the gallery murmured in agreement the way it always did, when someone reminded the humans that they were nothing. Kane stopped speaking. He looked at the Vreth ambassador for a long moment, and something in his pale eyes made the ambassador's mandibles twitch in a way that he would later be unable to explain. "Let the record show," Kane said quietly, "that we asked," turned and walked out of the chamber. He did not look back. Within 1 hour, a coded message was transmitted from Earth to every human being living or working in conclave space. The message was 2 words long: Prometheus rising. Within 18 hours, something impossible happened. Every human in the galaxy vanished. Merchants closed their shops and left. Diplomats walked out of embassies that locked behind them with security codes that no alien slicer could crack. Cultural workers and teachers and doctors and engineers simply disappeared from their posts, slipping away through routes they had memorized years ago for exactly this moment. Aid stations went dark. Human restaurants closed their doors. Music stopped playing on the border stations where alien youth had grown up on human songs. The galaxy woke up one morning and the humans were gone, every single one of them, and the silence they left behind was louder than any declaration of war. The Vreth ambassador contacted his homeworld to report what he called an amusing tantrum by the prey species. His communication officer interrupted him with a face that had gone pale beneath its exoskeleton. All Vreth military relay stations in 4 sectors had gone dark simultaneously. Before the ambassador could process this, the lights in the conclave chamber flickered. A junior aide burst through the doors with the kind of panic in his eyes that the ambassador had only seen once before, on the face of a species that was about to lose a war. "Ambassador," the aide gasped, "the humans, they are everywhere." For the first time in his long and violent life, the Vreth ambassador felt something cold crawl up his spine. It was a feeling that humans had a word for. They called it dread. The galaxy had seen thousands of wars. It had never seen anything like this. In the first 6 hours, the Vreth hegemony lost its ability to coordinate its military. Human cyber warfare units that had been studying Vreth communication protocols for decades launched a synchronized attack on every relay station and command node in 4 sectors simultaneously. The Vreth military was the largest single fighting force in the conclave, with over 40,000 warships and billions of soldiers, and in 6 hours it became 40,000 warships that could not talk to each other. Commanders screamed orders into systems that returned static. Fleets that were supposed to be converging on defensive positions instead drifted in confusion, each one isolated and blind. The Vreth had never considered this kind of attack because the Vreth had never needed to. In their entire history, no species had ever targeted their communications first. Supposed to be simple. You gathered your fleet, you met the enemy, you destroyed them. The humans did not play by these rules. The humans did not play by any rules. In the Shalkora Dominion, the destruction was more elegant. The slipgates that connected Shalkora space, many of them built or repaired by human engineers over the last 4 decades, activated their hidden military overrides at the same moment. Reinforcement fleets that jumped through gates expecting to arrive at rally points found themselves deposited in empty space millions of kilometers from where they intended to be. 3 Shalkora battle groups were redirected directly into each other's flight paths at faster-than-light speeds. The resulting collisions created debris fields that would be visible for centuries. The Shalkora, beings who thought in centuries and planned in millennia, had never imagined that the helpful human engineers who had fixed their gates and smiled and asked for nothing had been building traps the entire time. In Drelkathi space, the strike was personal. Marine teams that had been embedded for years in Drelkathi territory as cultural workers and aid volunteers shed their civilian clothes and revealed the weapons and armor they had hidden in compartments so cleverly designed that Drelkathi security had scanned them 100 times and found nothing. 3 critical Drelkathi shipyards, were seized before a single alarm was raised. But the main assault went to New Carthage. Admiral Vasquez himself directed the liberation from the bridge of the patient hand. Human dropships punched through the atmosphere in waves, delivering Marines directly onto the surface in the largest planetary assault humanity had ever conducted. The Drelkathi garrison on New Carthage numbered 15,000 soldiers. They had been guarding slaves for years, and they had grown comfortable and lazy, and they had forgotten what it felt like to face an enemy that wanted to kill them. The human Marines did not forget. Many of them were the sons and daughters of the original colonists. They had grown up watching footage of their parents and siblings in chains. They fought with a cold, focused fury that the Drelkathi had no answer for. The garrison surrendered in 9 hours. When the doors of the labor camps opened, human soldiers walked in and found their families. The footage was broadcast across every galactic communication channel. Soldiers on their knees, holding children who were too thin and too scared and too confused to understand that they were free. The galaxy watched. For the first time, some of them were not laughing. The middle months of the war were chaos. The conclave rallied because it had to. Despite the devastation of the first days, the numbers were still overwhelmingly in their favor. Warships. The conclave, even in its fractured state, could field over 150,000. But numbers meant nothing when the coalition could not agree on who was in charge. The Vreth demanded supreme command because they had the largest fleet. The Shalkora refused because they did not trust Vrev's strategy. The Drelkathi blamed both for the initial failures and threatened to withdraw entirely. Smaller species who had been dragged into the war by treaty obligations began looking for excuses to stay home. And through every crack in this crumbling alliance, humanity drove like a wedge. Human ships refused to die the way alien ships did. Galactic naval doctrine was built on the idea of decisive engagement. 2 fleets met, one was destroyed or surrendered, and the loser accepted terms. Human ships did not accept terms. The Vreth destroyed a human dreadnought's engines and weapons, and tore away half its hull, and the crew used their last reserves of power to turn the burning wreck toward the nearest Vreth carrier and ram it at full speed. This happened not once but dozens of times. Human crews fought until their ships were falling apart around them, and then they found ways to make the falling apart useful. The Vreth were predators who understood dominance and submission, and they had absolutely no framework for understanding an enemy that simply refused to stop. It terrified them in a way that no military defeat ever had. Humanity fought with a creativity that bordered on insanity. They filled cargo drones with mining explosives and sent them drifting into enemy fleet formations disguised as wreckage. They weaponized comets, redirecting them into supply depots with tiny course corrections made months in advance. They hacked alien ship computers and turned automated defense systems against their own crews. They deployed psychological warfare that hit harder than any missile. Every human military broadcast included the names and faces of the 40,000 people who had died on Harvest 7, scrolling endlessly alongside images from the New Carthage labor camps. Every alien soldier who fought the humans was forced to look at what their civilization had done. Some of them stopped fighting. The smaller species that humanity had befriended over decades began defecting, first in secret and then openly. An entire fleet of Korath light cruisers, a minor species that had been tributary class for 800 years, turned their guns on a Vreth supply convoy and declared their allegiance to the Terran Accord. Others simply withdrew from the war and sent quiet messages to human commanders, saying they would not fight against the only species that had ever treated them with dignity. The coalition was bleeding, and then came the battle that broke its spine. The Shalkora homeworld was the symbolic heart of the Conclave's power. It was an ancient world orbiting a blue giant star, and the crystal spires of its cities had stood for 10,000 years, and no enemy had ever come within 100 light-years of its surface. Admiral Vasquez brought his fleet there not to destroy it, but to surround it. 300 human warships formed a blockade so tight that nothing could enter or leave the system. The Shalkora fleet scrambled to respond, but their reinforcements were still lost in empty space, courtesy of the slipgate overrides, and the ships that remained were not enough to break through. Vasquez broadcast a message to the surface in the Shalkora language. His pronunciation was terrible, and he did not care. "We could glass your world in an hour," he said. "We will not. That is the difference between us and you. But you will sit here, and you will feel what it is like to be helpless, and you will remember that we tried to be your friends." Lasted 2 months. The Shalkora were crystalline beings who needed specific wavelengths of stellar radiation to sustain their biology. The blockade's interference fields filtered just enough of that radiation to make them uncomfortable, then weak, then desperate. They surrendered on the 63rd day. The Conclave as a functioning body effectively ceased to exist. Only the Vreth fought on. They fought because they did not know how to do anything else, and because the Vreth Queen had declared that surrender to a prey species was worse than extinction. She gathered the largest fleet the hegemony had ever assembled, 8,000 warships drawn from every corner of Vreth space, and she pointed them at the one target that she believed would end the war in a single stroke: Earth. Admiral Vasquez received the intelligence report, and for the first time in the war, his calm exterior cracked. He split his fleet and sent half racing back toward the Sol system at maximum speed. The Battle of Sol was about to begin, and Earth, the quiet blue world that had started all of this by reaching out its hand in friendship, prepared to defend itself for the first time in centuries. 8,000 Vreth warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and the sky above Earth changed forever. The people of Earth had known they were coming. Admiral Vasquez had sent word ahead, and every human on the homeworld had been given the same choice: evacuate to the underground shelters or stay and fight. Most of them stayed. Orbital defense platforms that had been disguised for decades as communication satellites and weather stations and research arrays powered up for the first time, unfolding into weapons platforms that bristled with railguns and missile batteries and energy projectors that the Vreth had never seen before. They had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. Civilian shipyards converted overnight into military staging grounds. Retired veterans who had not worn a uniform in decades reported to anti-orbital batteries that had been built beneath parks and schools and shopping centers. Teachers and accountants and farmers strapped on body armor and took positions alongside professional soldiers. A 70-year-old woman who had been a ship engineer before she retired climbed into the gunnery chair of a defense platform above Sao Paulo and told the young soldier next to her that she had been waiting for this day since Harvest 7. The Battle of Sol lasted 9 days. Every hour of it was broadcast live to the entire galaxy, because human communication networks were the only ones still functioning reliably, and humanity wanted the universe to watch. They wanted everyone to see what happened when you pushed a peaceful species past its limit. The Vreth came in waves, their black ships cutting through the void like a swarm of hornets, and they hit Earth's defenses with everything they had. The first 2 days were the worst. Vreth assault carriers broke through the outer perimeter and reached low orbit, and for a few terrible hours, alien weapons rained fire on human cities. Sao Paulo took a direct hit that leveled 6 city blocks. The port city of Busan burned for 18 hours. A Vreth strike group targeted the Terran government complex in Geneva and reduced it to rubble, though Chancellor Kane had already relocated to a bunker deep in the Swiss mountains. Humanity bled, but humanity held. The defense platforms chewed through Vreth formations with coordinated fire that the insectoid commanders could not predict, because human tactical AI kept changing patterns every 90 seconds. Ground-based railguns fired tungsten rounds into orbit at velocities that punched through Vreth armor like paper. Admiral Vasquez arrived on the fourth day with 1,200 warships and hit the Vreth fleet from behind, and the battle turned from a siege into a massacre. The Vreth fought with savage desperation. They had come to destroy the human homeworld and end the war. They could not comprehend that they were losing. Ship after ship after ship was torn apart in Earth's orbit, until the wreckage formed a ring of debris that reflected sunlight down onto the surface like a second dawn. On the ninth day, the Vreth Queen's flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Eternal Hunger, found itself surrounded and crippled, with its engines dead and its weapons offline, and fires burning on every deck. The Queen made her final decision. She ordered her helmsman to aim the dying flagship at Earth, and use the last of the emergency thrusters to push it into a collision course. Even in defeat, she would destroy the human homeworld. Even in death, she would kill billions. The flagship began to fall. It was a small ship that stopped her. The TAS Olive Branch was a frigate, one of the smallest combat vessels in the human fleet, with a crew of 140 volunteers. It had been named deliberately. Was a woman named Yuki Tanaka, who had lost her parents on Harvest 7 when she was 6 years old, and who had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment. She did not hesitate. The Olive Branch accelerated to full speed and placed itself directly between the falling Vreth flagship and the planet below. Captain Tanaka opened a channel that every human on Earth could hear. "We came in peace," she said, and her voice was steady. "You brought us here. Remember that." The Olive Branch detonated its reactor core at point-blank range. The explosion consumed both ships in a flash of light that was visible from the surface with the naked eye. 140 volunteers, who had known exactly what they were signing up for when they crewed a ship called the Olive Branch. They saved 8 billion lives. The Vreth fleet, leaderless and broken, surrendered within hours. The war was over. It had lasted 11 months. Silence settled over the galaxy, and the fires cooled, and the last pieces of wreckage drifted into stable orbits. The universe held its breath and waited to see what the humans would do. History said they should conquer. Every species that had ever won a war this decisive had claimed dominion over the defeated. The Dominion Index demanded it. The Conclave's entire structure was built on the assumption that the strong would rule the weak, because that was the natural order of things. Chancellor Elias Kane, the Ice Chancellor, the man who had orchestrated the most devastating military campaign in galactic history, with a voice that never rose above a whisper, stood before the ruins of the Conclave and made an offer that no one expected. He proposed the new accord, a reformed galactic government built not on conquest but on mutual sovereignty, a system where no species was ranked above another, a framework of laws that applied equally to the powerful and the powerless, a galaxy where a species earned respect not by how many worlds it had burned, but by how many it had helped. The chamber was silent. In the lower tiers, where the small species sat, the ones who had been tributary class for centuries and millennia, beings who had never known anything but the boot on their neck, something happened that the old Conclave had never seen. They wept. Dozens of species wept openly because a hand was being extended to them, and for the first time in their history, it was not a hand that would strike them if they reached for it. The new accord was ratified with the largest majority vote in galactic history. The three patron species, the Vreth, the Shalkora, and the Drelkathi, were stripped of their special status, but were not destroyed, were not enslaved, were not subjected to the same cruelties they had inflicted. They were simply made equal. Some of them understood what a gift that was. Some of them never would. On Harvest 7, where 40,000 people had died, and where this story had truly begun, a memorial was built. It was simple, as the best memorials are. A human hand, carved from white stone, reaching upward with its palm open. Beneath it, engraved in every known galactic language, were words that would be read by billions of beings for thousands of years to come. We reached out our hand in friendship. You struck it down. So we made a fist, but a fist can open again. This hand is still reaching. Take it. Years passed. The galaxy healed slowly the way all wounded things heal, with setbacks and arguments and difficult conversations, and the long, slow work of building trust where there had been none. The new accord was not perfect, because nothing built by living beings ever is, but it held, and it grew, and it became something that the old conclave could never have imagined. Corridor of the new accord's central station. A young Vreth diplomat paused. She was the granddaughter of the ambassador who had laughed at Adizea Conquo all those decades ago. She had grown up on stories of the human war, the species that had broken the most powerful empire in galactic history in less than a year. She had been taught to fear them, but what she saw in front of her was not fearsome. A group of human children were playing with alien children in the wide sunlit corridor. Vreth and Shalkora and Drelkathi and a dozen other species, all of them laughing and chasing each other and sharing snacks and arguing about the rules of some game that seemed to involve a lot of running and shouting. A human boy was teaching a young Vreth how to throw a ball, and the Vreth kept accidentally crushing it with his mandibles, and both of them were laughing so hard they could barely stand. The young diplomat watched for a long time. Then she turned to a passing human official, an older man with kind eyes and gray at his temples. "How do you do this?" she asked, and her translator carried every shade of her confusion. "How are you so gentle after everything we did to you?" This human looked at the children. He watched them play for a moment, and a smile crossed his face, small and warm and just a little bit sad. "Because this is who we wanted to be all along," he said. He looked at her, and his eyes held 42 years of patience and 11 months of war, and a lifetime of choosing kindness, even when the universe made it so very hard. "You just would not let us." The Vreth diplomat stood there for a long time after he walked away. She watched the children play, and for the first time in her life, she understood something that her grandfather never had. The humans had not won because they were the strongest. They had won because even after everything, even after the blood and the fire and the terrible fury of a patient species finally pushed beyond its limits, they had never lost sight of who they wanted to be. And they had fought the entire war not to destroy the galaxy, but to build one worth living in. The hand was still reaching. All anyone had to do was take it.